In 1946, a crowd of thousands gathered in a Polish city, not to celebrate, not to protest, but to watch men die. And the men being hanged weren't soldiers killed in battle. They were guards. Men who had spent years at a camp most people have never even heard of, a place called Stutthof. And what happened at that camp? What these men did was so extreme, so documented, so undeniable, that the Polish government decided the execution couldn't just happen inside a prison courtyard. It had to happen in public. But here's what almost no one talks about: why specifically the male guards? What did they do that was different? What was Stutthof hiding that the world wasn't supposed to see? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand something about human nature, about power, and about what ordinary men are capable of that most history books are too afraid to say directly. Stutthof. The name doesn't hit as hard as Auschwitz or Dachau. It doesn't come up in most school textbooks. But that's almost the point. Stutthof was the first Nazi concentration camp established outside German borders, and it was one of the last to be liberated. It operated for nearly 6 full years. From September 1939 to May 1945, over 110,000 prisoners passed through its gates. Roughly 65,000 of them did not survive, and the people running it? Mostly ordinary men. Men who had families. Men who wrote letters home. Men who, in another life, might have been school teachers or farmers or shopkeepers. That's what makes this story impossible to look away from. Before we go further, if you're new to X History, this channel is where we go deep into the stories that actually shaped the modern world. No fluff, no filler. Just real history, told the way it deserves to be told. Hit subscribe so you don't miss Part 2. Because what comes next is where this story gets genuinely disturbing. Let's go back to the very beginning. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. Within days, Nazi forces occupy the small town of Stutthof, near the Baltic coast, near the city of Danzig, and almost immediately, local SS officials begin converting a collection of old wooden buildings into something much darker. By September 2nd, literally one day after the invasion began, the first prisoners arrived. Think about that. The ink on the invasion orders was barely dry, and already men were being processed, numbered, and locked inside. The first prisoners weren't Jewish. They were Polish civilians. Intellectuals, activists, priests, teachers. People the Nazis considered enemies of the Reich. People who could organize resistance. People with ideas. The Nazis always feared ideas more than weapons. But here's what's strange about Stutthof's early years. Compared to what it became, the camp in 1939 was almost bureaucratically calm. Guards followed procedures. There were rules on paper. A structure. So what changed? What turned a political detention camp into one of the most brutal sites of mass murder in all of occupied Europe? The answer is a combination of 3 things: scale, ideology, and permission. By 1942, the Nazi genocide was no longer a secret operation. It was a policy. The infamous Wannsee Conference in January 1942 formalized what many already knew. The plan was total extermination of Jewish people across Europe, and Stutthof received its orders. The camp expanded rapidly. New barracks were constructed. A gas chamber was built. A crematorium followed, and with the expansion came new guards, hundreds of them processed through SS training, taught to see prisoners not as human beings, but as numbers. Threats, subhumans. The language mattered. The dehumanization was deliberate. Because if you can convince a man that what's standing in front of him isn't really a person, you can get him to do almost anything. There's a detail that survivors mentioned. again and again in their testimonies. The guards at Stutthof weren't always screaming or raging. Sometimes they were chatting, laughing between themselves about something mundane, dinner plans, a football score, a joke one of them had heard. And then, in the same breath, they would turn and commit an act of violence so casual it seemed rehearsed. That combination, the normalcy and the cruelty, is what haunted survivors most. Not the monsters. The ordinary men who had simply decided that the people in front of them didn't matter. Decided that their own comfort, their status, their place in the hierarchy, was worth more than another human life. But here's the thing about Stutthof that separates it from other camps in the historical record. When the war ended and the trials began, the prosecutors didn't just go after the commanders. They went after the guards, the mid-level men, the ones who said, "I was just following orders." And the Polish court looked at the evidence, the survivor testimonies, the records, the photographs, and made a decision that sent a message across Europe. Following orders was not a defense. It never was. The hangings were scheduled. The public was invited. We established what Stutthof was, the first Nazi camp outside German borders, a place that ran for 6 brutal years, and a site where ordinary men made extraordinary choices to destroy human lives. But now we need to talk about those men specifically. Who were the guards of Stutthof? What exactly did they do inside those walls? And why, out of all the perpetrators tried after the war, did the Polish court decide these men needed to die in front of thousands of watching eyes? Because the answer isn't just about punishment. It's about something far more complicated, something that still matters today. Most of the male guards at Stutthof came through the SS 10-cap verb, the Death's Head units. These were the SS formations specifically assigned to run concentration camps. They weren't frontline soldiers. They weren't drafted reluctantly. Many of them applied, and the training they received was specifically designed to break down one thing: empathy. Recruits were taught that weakness was a disease, that prisoners were dangerous, that mercy was a form of betrayal to the Reich. Instructors didn't just teach violence, they rewarded it. Guards who showed hesitation were mocked. Guards who showed brutality were promoted. The system didn't just attract cruel men, it manufactured them. But here's the detail that prosecutors kept returning to during the trials. Stutthof. The guards had choices that weren't available in every camp. The structure was looser in certain ways. There were moments, documented moments, where guards could have looked the other way, could have slowed down, could have done less. Some didn't take those moments. Some actively sought out opportunities to do more. The trial records from 1946 are extraordinarily detailed. Survivor testimony after testimony described the same patterns. Guards conducting roll calls in freezing Baltic winter temperatures, prisoners forced to stand for hours, sometimes until people collapsed and died where they stood. Not because it was operationally necessary, because the guards let it continue when they could have ended it. Prisoners were beaten for making eye contact, beaten for not making eye contact, beaten for asking questions, beaten for staying silent. There was a particular form of punishment used at Stutthof that survivors described with remarkable consistency. Prisoners were forced to kneel on gravel or sharp stones for hours while guards sat nearby, watching, smoking, indifferent. Not rage, not chaos, indifference. That indifference is what made the prosecutor's case so powerful in court. And then there's the detail that feels almost impossible to process. Some of these same guards, the ones documented, committing these acts, sent warm, loving letters home to their families, letters that talked about missing their mother's cooking, about looking forward to Christmas. about hoping their younger brother was doing well in school. Normal human feelings. Genuine human feelings, existing simultaneously with what they were doing every single day inside that camp. Psychologists who studied the Nuremberg and subsequent trials called it doubling the psychological ability to split yourself into two functioning selves. The man at home, the man at the camp. Two separate identities that never fully confronted each other. It wasn't madness. It was adaptation, and that might be the most terrifying thing about Stutthof. Not that monsters ran it, but that functional feeling human beings ran it and went home and slept fine. When Soviet forces reached Stutthof in May 1945, most of the SS personnel had already fled. The camp commandant, Johann Pauli, had escaped westward. Many guards had simply dissolved into the chaos of a collapsing Germany, hoping to blend back into civilian life. But the Soviets and Polish authorities were meticulous. They gathered evidence. They collected records because, unlike some camps, Stuttof's administrators had kept detailed documentation, lists, logs, schedules. The paper trail was damning, and when Polish investigators began tracking down survivors and cross-referencing testimonies with those records, a picture emerged that was impossible to dismiss or minimize. Here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. When the Stutthof trials began in Gdańsk in 1946, the prosecution made a deliberate strategic decision. They weren't going to focus only on the top commanders. They were going to hold individual guards personally accountable. Men who claimed they were just small pieces of a large machine. Men who said the real decisions were made above them. The prosecution's argument was simple and devastating. You had a trigger. You pulled it. You had a fist. You used it. You had a choice, even inside that system, and you chose this. The court agreed, and the sentences handed down weren't quiet. They weren't private. The Polish government made sure of that. On July 4, 1946, in the city of Gdańsk, a scaffold was erected in a public square. Thousands of Polish citizens, many of them survivors, many of them families of victims, gathered to watch, and one by one, the male guards of Stutthof were brought forward. Why public? Why not behind closed doors, like most post-war executions? The answer reveals something about justice, about memory, and about what Poland needed in 1946 that goes far deeper than simple revenge. We met the men, the guards who ran Stuttof's daily machinery of cruelty. Not monsters in the fictional sense. Ordinary men who adapted, who split themselves in two, who went home and wrote letters while prisoners froze in roll calls. Outside, the trials found them guilty. The sentences were death. But the Polish government didn't just want them dead. They wanted something else entirely, something that a quiet prison execution could never deliver, and understanding what they wanted and why is the real lesson of Stutthof. The one that echoes all the way into the present-day post-war Poland in 1946 was a country carrying wounds that hadn't even begun to close. Nearly 6 million Polish citizens had died during the German occupation, roughly 17% of the entire population. Streets that once had neighbors were empty. Families that once had 10 members now had 2. And across the country, a quiet, devastating question was spreading like smoke. Did anyone see what happened? Does anyone actually know what was done to us? Because one of the cruelest aspects of the Nazi camp system was its deliberate invisibility. Camps like Stutthof were designed to make people disappear, not just physically, but from memory, from record, from acknowledgement. A private execution in a prison courtyard would have continued that invisibility. The Polish government refused. Here's what most historical summaries leave out about the public. Hangings, the decision wasn't made in anger. It wasn't made impulsively. It was made after careful legal and political deliberation, because Polish authorities understood something that modern justice systems still debate. Punishment alone doesn't heal a society. Witness does. The date was July 4, 1946. The location, Biskupia Gorka Hill. On the outskirts of Gdańsk, a scaffold had been constructed, visible, elevated, open to the sky. Estimates suggest between 60,000 and 100,000 people gathered that day. Some had traveled from distant cities. Some were survivors of Stutthof itself. Some were families of those who never came home. Some were simply Polish citizens who felt that seeing this moment was a civic duty. The atmosphere, by all historical accounts, was not celebratory. It was heavy, quiet in moments. The kind of silence that only comes when an entire crowd is holding something enormous inside their chests simultaneously. The men executed that day included Johann Pauli, the camp commandant, along with several senior male guards convicted of direct participation in killings, torture, and the administration of the gas chamber program. Each man was brought forward in turn. Survivors in the crowd, who recognized the faces, recognized the hands. The voices, the eyes, watched in silence. There were no dramatic speeches from the condemned, no grand final statements. Most of them, according to witness accounts, looked small, diminished, like men who had finally run out of the system that had made them powerful. Outside that system, standing on a scaffold in the open air, they were just men, ordinary, small, cornered men. One survivor, in a testimony recorded years later, described watching the execution from the crowd. She said she had spent months after liberation unable to feel anything, numb in a way that frightened her. She had wondered if the part of her that could feel had simply died inside the camp, along with so many others. She said that standing on that hill, watching justice administered in the open air, in front of tens of thousands of witnesses, she didn't feel joy. She didn't feel relief exactly. She said she felt real again, like the world had finally acknowledged that what happened to her, what happened to all of them, was true, was seen, was remembered. That acknowledgement, she said, was worth more than she could explain. Historians and legal scholars have revisited the Stutthof executions many times in the decades since, and the consensus that emerges is nuanced but clear. The public nature of the executions served three functions that a private execution never could. First, it provided collective witness to a society that had been forced to suffer in silence and invisibility. Second, it established an unambiguous public record. These men were guilty. This is what guilt looked like. This is what accountability looked like. Future generations would know. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it sent a message that traveled far beyond Gdańsk, far beyond 1946. Ordinary men who make extraordinary choices to destroy human lives will be held personally responsible, not just the commanders, not just the architects, the hands, the voices, the men who stood at the wire. Stutthof is not a famous name. But maybe it should be, because the story of Stutthof isn't really about Nazi Germany. It's about what happens when ordinary people are given power over other human beings and choose to use it without mercy. It's about what a society owes to its victims, not just justice behind closed doors, but acknowledgement in the open air in front of witnesses, on the record. And it's about a question that doesn't go away, no matter how many decades pass. When given the choice between cruelty and conscience, what will ordinary people choose? The guards of Stutthof gave their answer. On July 4, 1946, Poland gave its. If this story moved you, if you feel like you understand something today that you didn't understand yesterday, that's exactly why X History exists. Subscribe, share this with someone who loves real history, and leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know what part of this story hit you hardest. Part 1 is still up if you missed it. And the next video, we're going somewhere just as deep. I'll see you there. I'll see you there.